I don't think I've ever finished an episode of Sister Wives feeling this unsettled. And that's saying something. Because what we just watched wasn't closure. It was a performance. A carefully packaged illusion designed to make it look like everything is healed, everyone has moved on, and the past should just stay buried. But here's the problem. Nothing is healed. Nothing is resolved. And pretending it is might be the most toxic thing this family has ever done. By the time the tell-all wrapped up, we were left with smiling faces, soft voices, and this repeated line about moving forward. No more digging into the past. No more rehashing old wounds. As if 15 years of damage can be erased just because it's uncomfortable to talk about. That's not healing. That's avoidance. They want viewers to believe apologies were enough. That somehow one conversation tied a neat little bow around decades of emotional chaos. But let's be honest. These people are not friends. They are not rebuilding anything. They are not one big happy family waiting for a reunion. They are strangers who share trauma. And what the show refused to confront is the fallout, especially for the children. There was no real conversation about the long-term damage. No accountability for the fractured relationships. No serious discussion about a father who has virtually no connection with some of his own kids. Instead, we got deflection. We got blame shifting. We got revisionist history. Suddenly, we're supposed to believe that Mary leaving had something to do with Jen. That after a decade of emotional abandonment, the real problem was a friend. Think about that. A man who didn't share a bed, didn't share a home, didn't share affection, didn't even share basic companionship. But now, years later, he's worried about who she talks to? That's not concern. That's control. And the way it was framed, like Jen was some dangerous influence, was honestly unbelievable. When someone speaks the truth about manipulation, about favoritism, about women being pitted against each other, suddenly they're not safe. Safe from what? The truth? Because let's be real. For years, Mary was isolated, sidelined, treated like an outsider in her own family. And now that she's finally stepping out of that fog, suddenly there's a need to rewrite history. Meanwhile, the deeper issues were barely touched. The emotional neglect, the fractured father-child relationships, the resentment that's been simmering for over a decade. It's easier to rehash the catfishing story for the 100th time than to admit the system itself was broken from the start. And that's what this really comes down to. Not one single relationship failed in isolation. The jealousy, the competition, the financial disputes, the emotional manipulation, the favoritism, they all trace back to the same root. A structure that forces women to compete for time, love, security, and survival. When multiple partners are tied to one man's approval, conflict isn't a surprise. It's inevitable. And that's the part no one wants to fully say out loud. Instead, we're handed this glossy ending. Smiles, polite words, carefully measured statements. But watch closely. The distance is obvious. Christine is speaking more openly than ever about the harm she experienced. About the darker realities of the belief system she grew up in. About abuse and power structures that were normalized for generations. That's not small. That's seismic. And it's uncomfortable. Because once you start pulling at that thread, everything unravels. It's easier to argue about old scandals than to admit the foundation itself was cracked. You can see the divide growing. Different perspectives on what really caused the collapse. Different levels of willingness to confront the truth. Some have stepped away mentally. Others may have stepped away physically, but not internally. And that difference changes everything. What struck me most wasn't anger. It was sadness. Sadness for the kids who grew up in front of cameras. Sadness for the women who were taught their worth depended on endurance. Sadness that even now, accountability feels selective. Because healing doesn't come from pretending nothing happened. It comes from acknowledging exactly what did. And this tell-all didn't do that. It skimmed the surface. It rehashed old wounds. It avoided the most uncomfortable questions. And then it tried to wrap it all up like a fairy tale ending. But life doesn't work like that. You don't spend decades in emotional chaos and walk away untouched. You carry it with you. Some are processing it. Some are confronting it. Some are still defending it. And that tension is still very much alive. If this really was the final chapter, it didn't feel like closure. It felt like a pause. So now I want to know what you think. Did this feel like healing to you, or damage control? Because from where I'm standing, the real story was never fully told. And maybe that's the most telling part of all. Something felt off from the very beginning. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just calculated. The entire tell-all carried this strange energy, like everyone had agreed in advance not to go too deep. Smiles were controlled. Words were softened. The message was repeated again and again. We don't want to live in the past. But when people insist that much on not revisiting history, it usually means the history is still uncomfortable. Because if everything was truly resolved, there wouldn't be this urgency to shut the door on it. By the time the final minutes rolled around, we were left with this polished narrative. Everyone has moved forward, everyone is content, the wounds have closed. Except, they haven't. You can see it in the distance between them. They are not rebuilding friendships. They are not reconnecting as a family unit. They're not even pretending to be emotionally close anymore. They are just separate. And separation is not the same thing as healing. What frustrated me most wasn't what was said. It was what was avoided. There was no real accountability. No serious discussion about the long-term emotional cost of everything that happened. No honest examination of how years of imbalance shaped every single relationship in that family. Instead, the spotlight shifted onto side characters. Suddenly, outside influences were framed as suspicious. Friends became scapegoats. Support systems were subtly painted as threats. Think about how strange that is. If a relationship collapses after someone gains clarity through a friendship, then the friendship isn't the issue. The instability was already there. For years, there were signs: emotional withdrawal, favoritism, distance, isolation. That doesn't happen overnight. That builds slowly, quietly, painfully. But instead of acknowledging that pattern, the narrative seemed determined to redirect responsibility. And that redirection says a lot. Because control doesn't always disappear just because a relationship ends. Sometimes it shifts. Sometimes it shows up in new forms, like questioning who someone talks to or labeling certain people as unsafe. When someone begins to think independently, that can feel threatening to those who benefited from their silence. And that's what this really looked like. Not betrayal. Not outside interference. But awakening. Meanwhile, the bigger picture remains untouched. What happens to children raised in a dynamic where attention is uneven? What happens when loyalty is tested constantly? What happens when love feels conditional? Those are the uncomfortable questions. And they were barely addressed. Instead, we revisited old scandals yet again. Moments that have already been dissected endlessly. It almost felt strategic. Safer to rehash something familiar than to confront the deeper structural issues. Because once you admit the foundation was flawed, everything else starts to make sense. The jealousy, the rivalries, the emotional withdrawal, the financial tension. They weren't random. They were symptoms. When multiple partners depend on one person's approval for validation and stability, imbalance isn't an accident. It's inevitable. And that imbalance doesn't just disappear because people move to different states or start new relationships. Some of them seem to be processing that truth now, speaking more openly, acknowledging harm in ways they never did before. Others still appear to defend the system, even if they no longer live inside it physically. And that divide is impossible to ignore. This tell-all didn't feel like closure. It felt like image control. A gentle wrapping paper placed over something that's still cracked underneath. Because real healing requires confrontation. And confrontation was the one thing noticeably missing. So instead of answers, we got politeness. Instead of accountability, we got reframing. And instead of resolution, we got distance, presented as peace. But distance isn't peace. It's just quiet. And sometimes quiet hides more than chaos ever did. And here's the part that really doesn't sit right. The conversation kept circling around old scandals, especially that one chapter from years ago, as if that was the moment everything fell apart. But let's be honest. By the time that situation happened, the relationship was already on life support. You can't call something an ultimate betrayal when emotional abandonment had already become the norm. When affection had disappeared. When connection had quietly died long before cameras caught the aftermath. Replaying that storyline again and again almost feels intentional. Because if you keep the focus on one dramatic event, you don't have to admit the deeper truth, that the relationship had been functionally over long before anyone said it out loud. And that pattern shows up everywhere. Instead of addressing the years of imbalance, the favoritism, the power struggles, the narrative keeps shrinking everything down to isolated incidents. But isolated incidents don't dismantle entire families. Systems do. What we watched wasn't just a marriage breakdown. It was the collapse of a structure built on competition. When multiple women are expected to share one man's time, attention, resources, and emotional energy, someone is always going to lose. And when someone loses consistently, resentment builds, silence builds, distance builds, until eventually, there's nothing left to save. What's unsettling is how lightly the long-term impact was handled, especially when it comes to the children. You don't grow up in a dynamic like that without carrying something with you. Confusion, loyalty conflicts, emotional gaps, questions about worth. And yet that part was almost invisible in the conversation. Instead, we were shown this softened version of events, like everything just organically drifted apart. But drift implies accident. And this wasn't accidental. There were choices made, priorities set, lines drawn. Some people were centered, others were sidelined. And you can't pretend that didn't shape the outcome. Another thing that stood out was how differently everyone seems to be processing the aftermath. Some are clearly unpacking their past. You can hear it in the way they talk now, less defensive, more reflective. There's a willingness to acknowledge harm that didn't exist before. Others still seem to frame everything through protection, protecting beliefs, protecting pride, protecting the narrative. And that difference is powerful. Because walking away physically is one thing. Untangling yourself mentally is something else entirely. You can move states. You can start a new relationship. You can rebuild your life. But if you don't question the foundation you came from, you're still carrying pieces of it with you. And that tension is visible. There's also this unspoken truth hanging in the air. Not everyone agrees on what actually caused the collapse. Some hint at structural flaws. Others reduce it to personality conflicts. But personality conflicts don't explain years of imbalance. They don't explain emotional isolation. They don't explain why communication consistently failed. When one person holds disproportionate authority in a family dynamic, accountability becomes optional. And that's dangerous, because without accountability, history gets rewritten. And that's exactly what this felt like. A careful rewriting, a selective retelling, a version of events that's smoother, safer, less disruptive. But viewers can sense when something's missing. The pauses, the guarded answers, the topics that shift too quickly. It all signals that the full story still hasn't been told. And maybe the hardest thing to admit is this. Some people have evolved, and some people haven't. You can see it in the confidence shift, in the way certain voices no longer tremble when they speak about the past, in the way boundaries are being drawn now that would have been unthinkable years ago. That kind of growth doesn't happen by accident. It happens when someone finally steps outside of a belief system and starts questioning it. And questioning is dangerous in environments built on obedience. Because once you start asking why, everything starts unraveling. Why were the women constantly competing? Why did attention feel like a prize instead of something stable? Why did loyalty always seem to flow upward instead of being shared equally? Why did accountability feel optional? These aren't small questions. They're foundational ones. And when you trace them back far enough, they don't lead to one argument, or one scandal, or one misunderstanding. They lead to structure. A structure that placed one person at the center and expected everyone else to orbit around him. And when that center decides who gets affection, who gets time, who gets financial support, who gets emotional validation, imbalance isn't surprising. It's guaranteed. What's even more telling is how defensiveness still shows up. Control doesn't always look loud and aggressive. Sometimes it looks like reframing. Sometimes it looks like minimizing. Sometimes it looks like insisting everything is fine now so no one digs deeper. But if everything was truly fine, there wouldn't be this need to control the narrative. There wouldn't be this urgency to redirect blame. There wouldn't be discomfort when certain truths are spoken out loud. The most revealing moments weren't explosive. They were subtle. A tightened expression. A quick shift in topic. A statement that contradicts years of visible behavior. Those small cracks say more than dramatic arguments ever could. And here's where it becomes heartbreaking. The children didn't choose this structure. They didn't choose the imbalance. They didn't choose the camera exposure. They simply grew up inside it. And when families fracture publicly, the emotional cost doesn't disappear just because adults decide to move on. Moving on is a choice. Processing is a process. And those are two very different things. Some of the adults appear to be doing the work, unpacking indoctrination, acknowledging harm, redefining their independence. Others still seem anchored to old narratives, still defending pieces of a system that clearly created division, still hesitant to fully admit that the framework itself may have been the root problem. And that divide is probably the clearest sign that this story isn't actually over. Because real closure requires collective honesty, not partial acknowledgement, not selective memory, not softened storytelling. If this truly is the end of this chapter, then what we watched wasn't resolution. It was containment. A controlled ending. A calm surface placed over unresolved tension. But here's the thing about tension. It doesn't vanish. It lingers. In body language. In guarded conversations. In the way certain topics are avoided altogether. And as viewers, we feel it. You can't spend over a decade watching a family unravel and suddenly accept that everything is neatly wrapped up because a final episode says so. The fractures were real. The imbalance was visible. The emotional distance was undeniable. And until those truths are fully owned, not edited, not softened, not redirected, the story will always feel incomplete. Maybe the cameras stopped, but the consequences didn't. And that's the part that stays with you long after the screen fades to black.